imagine for a second that you are just 18 years old.
Okay.
You are standing in this grand, echoing hall. You're dressed in heavy velvet and gold, and suddenly someone just hands you the keys to an entire kingdom.
Like the literal keys to the treasury.
Exactly. We are talking about immense, staggering wealth. A literal crown gets placed on your head, and you have this intense, suffocating expectation of millions of people resting entirely on your young shoulders.
Yeah, that's incredibly heavy.
Right. The kingdom's economy, its military readiness, foreign policy, especially in a rapidly destabilizing Europe, it is all legally, technically yours to manage.
But there's a catch, right?
Huge catch. You have absolutely zero interest in ruling. You look at the generals and the politicians with their ledgers and treaties, and you feel nothing but, well, profound alienation.
I mean, that sounds terrifying.
Totally. All you really want to do, deep down in your marrow, is lock the heavy oak doors of the palace, listen to epic, sweeping opera, and build the most elaborate, skyscraping fairy tale castles imaginable.
You basically want to live inside a storybook, not a parliament.
Exactly. You want the myth, not the reality.
Which sounds, on the surface, like the ultimate teenage daydream. Right. I mean, I think we all have that impulse.
For sure.
We all want to escape reality sometimes, to just shut out the noise of responsibilities and retreat into something beautiful. But when you hold the geopolitical fate of a major European state in your hands...
Yeah, the stakes are a bit higher than skipping school.
Just a bit. When your borders are being threatened by rising empires, and your treasury is tied to the survival of your people, treating your kingdom like a private, theatrical sandbox has catastrophic consequences.
Right.
It ceases to be a daydream. It becomes a deeply complex, incredibly dangerous psychological crisis.
Which is exactly why we are plunging into this specific story today. Welcome to the Deep Dive. We are looking at a massive, really fascinating stack of sources today.
We really are.
We've got historical biographies from the 19th century, modern architectural records, retrospectives on European geopolitics, detailed psychiatric analyses.
And the letters. Don't forget the letters.
Yes. Perhaps most compelling of all, these intensely personal, almost uncomfortable letters between a king and a legendary, highly controversial composer.
They are wild to read.
They really are. So our mission today is to construct a psychological portrait of King Ludwig II of Bavaria. And to be clear, right off the bat, we aren't just going to look at dry dates, troop movements, or trade agreements.
No, we're going way deeper than that.
We are going to unpack his obsessive, deeply codependent bond with Richard Wagner. We're going to step inside the actual physical rooms of Neuschwanstein Castle to decode his mind.
It's basically an architectural brain scan.
That's a great way to put it. And finally, we are going to unravel the century-old bloody mystery of his tragic death on the shores of a dark lake.
And if we, connect this to the bigger picture, the reason this history matters to you listening to this right now is that we live in an age where we are constantly curating our own digital fantasy worlds.
Oh, absolutely. To escape the crushing stress of modern life.
Think about it. We build perfectly curated social media feeds that show only the most aesthetic versions of our lives.
Right, the highlight reel.
Exactly. We sink hundreds, sometimes thousands of hours into immersive video games, building entire virtual cities where we have total control.
Or we put on VR headsets to literally blind ourselves to the physical room we're sitting in.
Exactly. And Ludwig's story is essentially the ultimate multi-million-dollar 19th century version of that exact human impulse.
Before the internet was even a concept.
Long before the internet. He literally built a physical limestone and iron reality to hide from the world.
Okay, let's unpack this by figuring out how a human mind gets to that point. Because you don't just wake up one day and decide to bankrupt a kingdom for a theatrical set piece.
You really don't. It's a process.
To understand the man who tried to live inside a myth, we have to start with the boy who was essentially raised inside one.
Right.
So Ludwig was born in 1845. He was named after his grandfather. They actually shared the same birthday, the feast day of St. Louis IX. And his environment from day one was, well, anything but normal.
No, not at all. He was born in Nymphenburg Palace in Munich, which was the main summer residence of the Bavarian rulers. But he spent his truly formative childhood years at Hohenschwangau Castle.
Which is a crazy place.
It is. This was a residence that had been rebuilt by his father, King Maximilian II. And I use the word rebuilt kind of loosely.
Because he basically built a fantasy fortress.
Pretty much. Maximilian had purchased the ruins of an old 12th century medieval fortress located in this incredibly dramatic, sweeping alpine valley. And he completely saturated the new structure in Germanic mythology.
Like it wasn't just a home with a few nice paintings.
Oh no. The walls were completely covered in neo-Gothic frescoes depicting the heroic sagas of the Middle Ages. Specifically, the entire environment was a monument to the legend of Lohengrin, the Swan Knight.
Okay, let's pause and talk about that legend. Because if you read the sources, it is the absolute blueprint for Ludwig's entire operating system later in life.
It really is. It's foundational.
So the Lohengrin myth is essentially about this mysterious magical knight who arrives on a boat pulled by a swan, right? And he comes to rescue a damsel in distress, Princess Elsa.
Yes, but there's a catch.
Right. The knight has one strict, absolute condition for his help and his love. Elsa must never, ever ask his name or where he comes from. He demands pure, unquestioning belief.
Unconditional faith.
Exactly. The second she asks, the second she brings earthly doubt into this magical equation, the spell is broken, and he has to leave her forever. It's essentially a story about the fragility of the ideal in the face of human reality.
That is a phenomenal summary. It is a mythology built entirely around isolation, divine purpose, and the tragedy of being misunderstood by the regular world.
Which sounds exactly like how Ludwig viewed himself.
Totally. Now, put a highly sensitive, imaginative child inside a castle where that story is literally painted floor to ceiling in every single room he walks through.
Everywhere he looks.
Yeah, and contrast that magical, heroic environment with the reality of his actual parents.
Oh man, his parents, because his real life was emotionally barren.
Absolutely barren.
His father, Maximilian, was this very academic, serious, rigid man. He was the kind of 19th century monarch who believed in science, history, and, physical toughness.
Which was not Ludwig's vibe at all.
Not even close. He actually forced young Ludwig to go on hunting expeditions. And Ludwig was this incredibly gentle, introverted soul who absolutely hated the sight of blood and despised harming animals.
He would literally cry during the hunts, wouldn't he?
He would cry. But Maximilian showed zero empathy for that. There is this historical anecdote from our sources that I find just, devastating.
The one about the walks?
Yeah. Someone at court suggested that the king take his young son on his daily walks through the gardens just to, bond like normal human beings.
And Maximilian's response was?
He scoffed at the idea and asked, "What am I to say to him?"
Wow. The emotional void there is just staggering. The idea of speaking to his own son simply for the sake of human connection was entirely alien to him.
Completely alien. And his mother, Marie of Prussia, was really no better.
No, she wasn't. She was highly religious, very dedicated to her royal charitable duties, and loved hiking and mountaineering. But she provided almost no maternal warmth to Ludwig or his younger brother Otto.
They were just heirs to her.
Exactly. The crown prince couple did their political duty by producing a male heir and a spare, but that was essentially the extent of their familial bond. The children were raised by governesses and tutors, strictly scheduled and emotionally starved.
And the psychological damage of that starvation is so painfully evident in how Ludwig spoke about his mother later in life.
Oh, this quote always gets me.
When he was an adult, he didn't call her mother, or even the formal queen mother. He coldly referred to her as my predecessor's consort.
That phrasing tells you everything you need to know about his emotional detachment.
Right, my predecessor's consort.
It strips her of any humanity, any maternal identity, reducing her entirely to a political function that has expired.
It's brutal. It's like Hohenschwangau was a 19th century immersive VR experience, like we mentioned earlier.
The walls were his reality.
Think about the logic here. If you are a child, and the real world consists of strict, punishing royal protocol, a father who literally doesn't know how to talk to you, and a mother who treats you like an awkward political prop.
You're going to check out.
Isn't it the most logical, natural survival mechanism in the world to prefer the painted walls? The walls are safe. The Swan Knight on the fresco doesn't judge you for not wanting to shoot a deer.
No, the knight is noble and perfect.
So he spent his days staging elaborate puppet shows, reading poetry, dressing up. He was internalizing the myth as a shield against a really cold reality.
The psychological scaffolding was firmly in place. He was primed, completely hollowed out and just waiting for something to fill him. And then in 1861, when Ludwig is 15 years old, the most pivotal moment of his youth occurs.
This is the turning point.
It really is. He is permitted to attend a performance at the Court Theater in Munich. The opera is Richard Wagner's Lohengrin.
The Swan Knight.
The Swan Knight.
The exact guy painted on his bedroom walls. I mean, imagine the absolute sensory overload for a kid. He has spent his entire life looking at static, silent paintings of this night. And suddenly, he is sitting in a dark theater, and that exact myth explodes into glorious, sweeping, three-dimensional reality.
And we really have to understand how Wagner's music operated. Richard Wagner wasn't just writing, catchy tunes.
Right, it wasn't just background music.
Not at all. He used a technique called the leitmotif. These short, recurring musical phrases associated with particular characters, places, or ideas. His music was designed to be psychologically overwhelming.
It hacked your emotions.
Exactly. It bypassed the intellect and went straight for the emotional jugular. For a 15-year-old boy who had been starved of emotion his entire life, hearing the sweeping, agonizingly beautiful overture of Lohengrin wasn't just entertainment.
It was religion.
It was a spiritual awakening. It shook Ludwig to his absolute core.
He starts reading Wagner's essays, buying his sheet music, learning the librettos by heart. Wagner essentially becomes his religion.
The music is the cure for his isolated inner world.
It validates all his daydreams. But then, the boy who is perfectly content living inside this musical fantasy world is suddenly and violently yanked into the harshest reality possible.
The worst-case scenario for him.
In early 1864, King Maximilian falls ill and dies incredibly suddenly after a brief illness. Ludwig is just 18 years old.
Just a kid.
He is completely unprepared. And just like that, the teenager is thrust onto the throne as King Ludwig II of Bavaria.
The historical records note his absolute terror at this moment. He wrote to his former governess that he felt he was called too early to face heavy responsibilities, that the burden was terrifyingly heavy for his young shoulders.
I mean, he had no training.
None. He hadn't been tutored in the intricacies of statecraft, economics, or military strategy. His father had kept him entirely out of government affairs.
But visually, he was the absolute archetype of a fairy tale king.
Oh, he looked the part perfectly.
Our sources describe him standing almost 2 meters tall, which is around 6'4", an absolute giant in the 19th century.
Towering over everyone.
And he was incredibly handsome, slender, with this thick, wavy dark hair and large, pale blue eyes. When he rode through the streets of Munich on his accession day, the Bavarian public went absolutely wild for him.
They loved him.
They had been ruled by this dry, academic, older man, and suddenly they have this stunning, romantic youth on a white horse. They literally called him the prince from the fairy tales.
The public infatuation was massive, but Ludwig's head wasn't in statecraft. It was completely in the clouds.
The Bavarian ministers are lining up, desperate to brief the new king on the budget, on the threat of the Prussian military, on foreign alliances.
And what does Ludwig do?
Literally, the very first major independent act of his reign, before addressing the military, before passing a single piece of legislation, he calls his cabinet secretary, Franz von Pfistermeister.
Poor Pfister.
And he gives him a mission. He doesn't send him to Paris or London to negotiate treaties. He sends him on a manhunt across Europe to find Richard Wagner.
It's unbelievable. He arms Pfistermeister with a portrait of himself and a precious ruby ring to give to the composer.
Which brings us to the man on the run. Let's delve into Wagner's situation at this exact moment in 1864, because the contrast between the king and the composer is mind-blowing.
It's night and day. Richard Wagner was 51 years old, and he was in absolute rock-bottom desperation.
Like legally and financially?
Both. To understand Wagner, you have to understand that he wasn't just a musician. He was a radical. During the revolutions of 1848, which swept across Europe trying to overthrow absolute monarchies, Wagner had been an active participant in the Dresden Uprising.
He was literally fighting the establishment.
He had been on the barricades, associating with anarchists and left-wing radicals. He had warrants out for his arrest.
We read the term Carbonarian in the sources to describe how people viewed him. What exactly did that mean to a 19th century Bavarian?
So a Carbonarian originally referred to members of a secret revolutionary society in early 19th century Italy. But by Wagner's time, it was kind of a catch-all slur used by conservatives to describe dangerous, anti-monarchist radicals.
Basically terrorists in their eyes.
Exactly. People who wanted to tear down the very establishment that Ludwig sat on top of. So Wagner had spent years in exile. And on top of his political baggage, his financial situation was catastrophic.
He was notoriously bad with money, right?
Wagner had a legendary inability to manage money. He demanded absolute luxury silks, expensive perfumes, grand pianos, despite having no steady income.
The guy liked the finer things.
He felt entitled to them. By 1864, he was heavily in debt, constantly dodging tax investigators, fleeing from city to city to escape creditors. He was staying in a hotel in Stuttgart, hiding, convinced his career was entirely over, and actively contemplating suicide.
And then there is a knock on his hotel room door.
Talk about timing.
It's the secretary of the King of Bavaria, holding a ruby ring and an invitation to come to Munich, promising that all his debts will be paid and his art will be fully funded forever.
It is the ultimate, unimaginable bailout.
Ludwig brings Wagner to Munich, pays off his massive debts, gives him a luxurious villa, and provides a staggering stipend. Over the course of their relationship, Ludwig lavishes nearly 1,000,000 guldens on Wagner.
Which is an insane amount of money.
Our economic sources equate that to over 50 million US dollars today.
Wow.
$50 million.
It is an unprecedented level of artistic patronage. Ludwig writes to Wagner saying, "The mean cares of everyday life I will banish from you forever."
So here's where it gets really interesting, and I want to push back on the romantic narrative of this relationship. I'm looking at these financial records and I'm reading the letters. From a modern, cynical perspective, I have to ask.
Was it a con?
Yeah. Was Wagner just the ultimate 19th century grifter? Because this looks exactly like a charismatic, desperate older celebrity conning a wealthy, highly emotional, vulnerable teenage superfan. Or was this truly a profound meeting of minds?
It's a phenomenal question, and the historical consensus synthesizes it as a deeply complex mixture of both. It wasn't purely a con, but Wagner absolutely manipulated Ludwig.
He knew what he was doing.
Well, Wagner was a master manipulator. He played up the infatuation because it was financially critical for him to do so. If we look at the letters, Wagner would use incredibly flirtatious, sycophantic, almost embarrassingly theatrical language.
What kind of things did he say?
He wrote things to the teenage king like, "I am in your angelic arms and we are near to one another." He called Ludwig his soul's savior. Wagner knew exactly how to flatter the young king's romantic, desperate need for connection.
It feels predatory. He is mirroring the exact language of the operas that Ludwig is obsessed with, basically weaponizing the Swan Knight mythology to keep the treasury doors open.
He absolutely weaponized it. But, and this is the crucial nuance, they simultaneously shared a genuinely held fanatical belief in the necessity of art with a capital A for the future of the German people.
So Ludwig wasn't completely blind.
Right. Ludwig wasn't just a dumb kid buying Wagner's affection. Ludwig deeply understood Wagner's artistic theories. He was buying into Wagner's vision of the Gesamtkunstwerk.
Okay, let's explain that term, Gesamtkunstwerk, for everyone.
It translates roughly to total work of art. Wagner believed that opera had become cheap and fragmented, just a series of showy areas to show off his singer's voice.
Like a concert rather than a story.
Exactly. He wanted to synthesize poetry, visual design, staging, and music into one cohesive, overwhelming artistic experience that could literally elevate society and express the soul of a nation.
And Ludwig bought into that 100%.
Ludwig believed in this vision completely. He felt that funding this art was his true royal duty, far more important than signing trade tariffs.
But, you can't just drop a 51-year-old, radical, debt-ridden, revolutionary composer into the middle of a deeply conservative Catholic 19th century kingdom and expect the politicians to applaud.
They definitely didn't applaud.
The establishment in Munich, the cabinet ministers, the aristocracy, the press, they absolutely despised Wagner.
They loathed him. And for very logical reasons. Imagine being the Bavarian Minister of Finance, trying to balance a budget while facing the threat of a Prussian invasion, and you watch your teenage king hand the equivalent of millions of dollars to a guy who previously tried to detonate a royal palace in Dresden.
It's the CFO's worst nightmare.
Furthermore, Wagner wasn't keeping a low profile. He was incredibly arrogant. He demanded audiences with the king, tried to influence political appointments, basically acting like the shadow ruler of Bavaria.
And the personal scandals. Wagner's private life was a public relations nightmare. While he is taking all this Bavarian state money, he is carrying on a highly scandalous open affair with a woman named Cosima von Bülow.
And the irony of who she was married to.
Right. The deeply ironic, twisted part of this is that Cosima was the illegitimate daughter of the famous composer Franz Liszt, and she was married to Hans von Bülow, the exact conductor who was employed to conduct Wagner's operas in Munich.
It's insane.
It was a literal soap opera playing out right in the king's face. The deeply conservative Catholic Munich public was outraged by the immorality of it all.
The local newspapers began running vicious campaigns against Wagner. They called him a paid parasite, a revolutionary with an insatiable appetite who was poisoning the mind of their young king.
They wanted him out.
The pressure reached an absolute boiling point in December 1865, just over a year into Ludwig's reign. The cabinet ministers banded together and delivered an ultimatum to the king. They essentially told Ludwig, "It is him or us. If Wagner does not leave Bavaria, the entire government will resign."
They practically forced Ludwig to exile his idol, and Ludwig is absolutely devastated. We see in his letters that he genuinely considers abdicating the throne right then and there.
He was ready to walk away from it all.
He wants to give up the crown of Bavaria just to follow Wagner into exile in Switzerland. He thinks ruling is a toxic chore compared to living near the creator of his beloved music.
And this is where the psychological dynamic of their relationship really reveals itself. Who stops Ludwig from abdicating?
Let me guess.
Wagner does. Wagner writes to him and insists that Ludwig must stay on the throne and bear his royal burden.
Wow. Not out of a noble sense of duty to the Bavarian people, I assume.
Well, perhaps a tiny sliver of duty, but primarily out of raw financial self-interest. Wagner was a pragmatist when he needed to be. If Ludwig abdicates, the flow of Bavarian treasury funds stops instantly.
Right. An exiled former king has no access to state wealth.
Exactly. So Wagner is set up in a gorgeous villa in Tribschen, Switzerland, completely funded by Ludwig's ongoing allowance, while Ludwig is forced to remain trapped in Munich, wearing a crown he increasingly despises.
Stripped of his idol's physical presence, trapped in a capital city he now resents, surrounded by ministers who force his hand, Ludwig's personal and political life begins to deeply fracture.
The fantasy has been pierced by reality.
And the political reality for Bavaria at this specific moment in history was an absolute nightmare. Let's shift gears and look at the geopolitical meat grinder that Ludwig found himself caught in.
To understand the crushing pressure on Ludwig, we have to understand the era of realpolitik.
Which translates to what exactly?
Realpolitik is politics or diplomacy based primarily on considerations of given circumstances and factors, rather than explicit ideological notions or moral and ethical premises. It's cutthroat, pragmatic power politics.
No morals, just results.
Exactly. And the absolute undisputed grandmaster of realpolitik was the Chancellor of Prussia, Otto von Bismarck.
Bismarck is essentially playing 3D geopolitical chess with the map of Europe, while Ludwig just wants to read medieval poetry and listen to cellos.
That is the perfect contrast. At this point, Germany, as a single, unified country, does not exist. It is a loose confederation of independent states, kingdoms, and duchies. The two massive dominant powers vying for control of the German-speaking world are the Austrian Empire to the south and the Kingdom of Prussia to the north. Bismarck's ultimate goal is to unify all the smaller German states under Prussian dominance. And to do that, he needs to kick Austria out of the equation. This leads directly to the Austro-Prussian War of 1866.
And Ludwig, honoring historical treaties and seeking to maintain Bavarian autonomy against the aggressive militaristic Prussians, sides with Austria, which turns out to be a massive historical miscalculation.
A catastrophic miscalculation. The Prussian military machine, heavily industrialized and brilliantly commanded, absolutely steamrolls the opposition. The war lasts a mere 7 weeks.
Just 7 weeks.
Bavaria and Austria are completely defeated. And this is where we have to look at the mechanical details of how a country loses its sovereignty. Bismarck doesn't just march into Munich and depose Ludwig. That would cause massive resentment.
Yeah.
Instead, he traps Bavaria legally.
Through a treaty.
Yes. He forces Ludwig to sign a peace treaty that includes a secret defensive and offensive alliance.
Right, I was reading the specifics of this treaty in our sources. It essentially meant that in peacetime, Ludwig maintained control of his army, but the second a war broke out with a non-German power, the entire Bavarian military was automatically placed under the supreme command of the King of Prussia.
Yep.
So Ludwig technically kept his crown, but he essentially just handed over the remote control to his military defense. He was castrated politically.
That is a perfect analogy. He retains the aesthetic trappings of a monarch, the robes, the palaces, the titles, but the actual hard power is gone. And the final nail in the coffin of Bavarian independence comes just a few years later, in 1871.
The Franco-Prussian War.
Exactly. Bismarck orchestrates a war with France. The Bavarian army, per the treaty, fights under Prussian command and helps secure a massive victory. Now, Bismarck decides it is time to officially create the German Empire.
But Bismarck has a delicate PR problem here, right?
A huge one. He cannot just announce that Prussia has conquered the rest of Germany. The other kings and princes would constantly rebel against a hostile takeover. He needs the other sovereigns to invite the Prussian king, Wilhelm I, to become the German emperor.
And as the king of Bavaria, which is the second largest state in the new empire, Ludwig is the only monarch with the historical prestige and weight to formally offer that imperial crown.
He needs Ludwig to legitimize it.
Bismarck needs Ludwig's signature on a letter, the famous Kaiser letter, begging Wilhelm to take the title. But why on earth would Ludwig agree to do this? We've seen his letters. He despises the Prussians.
He hates them.
He literally calls them arrogant Philistine militarists. He hates Berlin. He wants nothing to do with this new iron and blood German empire.
He wouldn't agree to it on principle. Never. But Bismarck knew Ludwig's weakness. Remember that massive $50 million Wagner debt? And the fact that Ludwig is starting to plan massive, impossibly expensive architectural projects. Right. Ludwig is privately financially underwater. So Bismarck executes one of the most brilliant, incredibly shady backroom deals in European history. He bribes the King of Bavaria.
I want to dig into the mechanics of this bribe because it's fascinating. Where does a chancellor get the secret cash to bribe a sitting monarch without their respective parliaments finding out?
Bismarck utilizes something called the Guelph Fund. During the 1866 war, Prussia had conquered the neighboring kingdom of Hanover, deposed its royal family, the House of Guelph, and simply seized their massive private fortune.
Oh, wow.
Bismarck kept this stolen fortune as a secret, unaccountable slush fund, completely hidden from the Prussian parliament. He uses this exact fund to secretly funnel roughly 6 million guilders to Ludwig. Bismarck literally buys Ludwig's signature on the Kaiser letter using stolen Hanoverian royal money.
It is the ultimate humiliation. Ludwig accepts the money because his obsession with his artistic projects overrides his political pride. But in doing so, he officially signs away his kingdom's independence.
He didn't even go to the ceremony, did he?
No. He didn't even attend the proclamation of the German Empire at Versailles. He stayed home. He becomes, in his own agonizing words from his diary, a mere shadow of a monarch. A glittering hood ornament on Bismarck's Prussian war machine.
His political agency is reduced to zero, and simultaneously, while his public life is crumbling into irrelevance, his private inner life is an absolute torture chamber.
We really have to look at his psychological state regarding his sexuality here.
It's vital to understanding him. Ludwig was a deeply devout, traditional Catholic. He believed fiercely in the divine right of kings and the moral teachings of the Church. But his personal diaries, which survived the centuries, reveal a man struggling profoundly with his sexuality.
He was gay in an era that completely rejected it.
He was clearly homosexual in an era, a culture, and a religion that not only condemned it, but viewed it as an absolute mortal sin.
The diaries are heartbreaking. He writes these desperate, anguished entries, pledging to remain pure, setting deadlines for himself to overcome his desires, and then expressing immense guilt when he fails.
The internal pressure must have been paralyzing.
And then you add the dynastic pressure. As a king, his absolute biological duty is to marry a woman and produce an heir to secure the lineage.
Precisely. To appease his ministers, his family, and perhaps to try and force himself into a conventional mold, in 1867 he became engaged to his cousin, Duchess Sophie Charlotte, in Bavaria.
And they bonded over Wagner, right?
Yes. Sophie was beautiful, and more importantly to Ludwig, she was one of the very few people who shared his absolute obsessive devotion to Richard Wagner's music. They would play Wagner's scores together on the piano. But the prospect of actual, physical, traditional marriage terrified him.
As the wedding date approached, his anxiety just skyrocketed.
He starts behaving erratically. He repeatedly postpones the wedding date. First it's set for August, then pushed to October, then November.
He's ordering the wedding carriages to be built, but he's simultaneously having panic attacks about the actual ceremony.
It causes a massive scandal in the courts of Europe.
Wow.
Sophie's father finally demands a firm commitment, and Ludwig snaps. He breaks off the engagement entirely.
And the way he breaks it off. This is, to me, the most telling psychological detail of his entire life. Look at the final letter he writes to Sophie.
Yes. In his final letter, dissolving the engagement and ending their relationship, he doesn't address her as Sophie, he addresses her as Elsa. And he signs the letter Heinrich.
Those are the lead characters from Wagner's Lohengrin.
It's incredible.
He is literally incapable of interacting with reality, even in his most traumatic, vulnerable, real-world personal crisis, without the protective buffer of the opera. He cannot face the pain of rejecting his cousin as Ludwig, so he role-plays as a mythical knight to do it.
It is a profound psychological retreat. Unable to be a true, absolute monarch in the political sphere because of Bismarck, and unable to live authentically in his personal life because of his religion and his era, Ludwig makes a monumental world historical decision.
Which is?
If the real world will not accommodate his ideals, if the 19th century is going to be defined by factories, parliaments, and Prussian cannons, he will simply build a world that will accommodate him. He retreats into stone.
Enter Neuschwanstein Castle. This is the pivot point. This is the ultimate escape. In 1869, he begins construction on this breathtaking, jagged alpine crag right above the ruins of the old castles where he played as a boy at Hohenschwangau.
It's a stunning location.
To use our modern analogy from the beginning of the deep dive, this isn't just building a summer house. This is like someone creating an incredibly elaborate, heavily coded private server in a video game, or curating a perfectly filtered, impenetrable social media aesthetic, but doing it in real life with millions of tons of white limestone and iron.
Right. It is a physical projection of a perfect world because the real one is too painful to touch.
And how he built it reveals everything about his state of mind. When a normal monarch builds a castle, they hire military engineers or conventional classical architects.
Right, for defense.
But Ludwig didn't do that. The primary designer he hired for Neuschwanstein was a man named Christian Jank. And Christian Jank's profession, he was a theatrical set painter.
He designed the stage backdrops for Wagner's operas in Munich.
Which is wild. How does a set painter design a load-bearing stone castle on the side of a mountain? What does that mean for the actual architecture?
It means the entire building is an illusion.
Yeah.
Jank designed the castle by painting dramatic, sweeping watercolor concepts of what a romantic medieval knight's castle should look like.
Like concept art.
Exactly. Then, actual architects and engineers had to figure out how to make that painting stand up against alpine winds. So, while Neuschwanstein looks like a 13th century fortress, it has absolutely no real fortifications. The walls couldn't withstand a single modern cannon shot.
It's just a facade.
It is. Behind the medieval limestone facade, the castle is built using cutting-edge 19th century industrial technology. It has a steel frame hidden inside the walls, central heating, flushing toilets, and an electric bell system for the servants.
Wow.
It is quite literally a giant, habitable, high-tech stage set masquerading as an ancient myth.
Let's do a psychological tour of the rooms, because walking through Neuschwanstein is like walking through the lobes of Ludwig's brain. Take the throne room.
Oh, the throne room is fascinating.
You walk into this massive, cavernous space. It's not Gothic. It's designed in a spectacular, glittering Byzantine style, heavily inspired by the Hagia Sophia. It's meant to represent the Hall of the Holy Grail from Wagner's final opera, Parsifal.
It's overwhelming to look at.
It has a massive dome painted with stars, a golden chandelier shaped like a Byzantine crown, and murals of holy kings covering the walls. The entire room is a screaming architectural thesis about the divine right of absolute monarchs. It is Ludwig yelling in stone that a king answers only to God, not to a parliament, not to Bismarck.
But what is the great glaring irony of this room?
There is no throne.
No throne. You have the grandest throne room in Europe, and there's a blank space on the dais.
Ludwig died before the throne could be completed and installed. It stands today as an unintentional, haunting, perfect symbol for his entirely unrealized power. A temple to absolute monarchy built by a king who had essentially no political power left.
And then you move to the Singers' Hall. This room occupies the entire fourth floor of the eastern section of the castle. It's a direct tribute to the Wartburg Castle and the setting of Wagner's opera Tannhäuser.
So more Wagner.
Always more Wagner. It's covered in murals depicting the saga of Parsifal and the Holy Grail. It is a massive shrine to medieval German poetry and chivalry, a space designed entirely for art.
Though, ironically, it was never used for a single musical performance during his lifetime.
Never. He built a concert hall just to walk through it alone.
And we must emphasize, Neuschwanstein was just the beginning of his architectural obsession. As his isolation deepened, the illusion escalated. He simultaneously began building Linderhof Palace in a different alpine valley.
Which was a completely different aesthetic.
Linderhof was a completely different fantasy. It was a manicured Rococo tribute to his other great historical idol, the absolute monarch Louis XIV of France, the Sun King.
And Linderhof is where things get truly eccentric, because behind this beautiful French palace, he builds the Venus Grotto.
The artificial cave.
Yes, it is an artificial cave dug into the mountain, and he installed one of the first private electrical generating plants in Bavaria just to power it.
For what?
so he could have changing colored electric lights illuminating a subterranean lake, complete with an artificial wave machine. And he would be rowed around in a golden boat shaped like a swan while listening to opera singers perform on a fake rock.
It is the ultimate sensory isolation chamber. I mean, it's Batman-level cave building, but for opera.
It really is.
Oh.
And then, as if that wasn't enough, he purchases an entire island in a Bavarian lake and begins building Herrenchiemsee, which was intended to be an exact, full-scale replica of the Palace of Versailles.
Because why not?
He was trying to recreate the absolute zenith of European monarchy, a time when kings were truly kings.
But his daily life at this point becomes completely inverted. He can't stand the sight of regular people. He becomes totally nocturnal. He sleeps all day behind heavy velvet curtains.
Just completely avoiding the daylight.
At night, he wakes up, eats massive meals, and rides through the frozen Alps in these incredibly elaborate high-tech sleighs, some of which were electrically illuminated, sometimes dressed in historical costumes.
The locals would just see him flashing through the snow in the dark.
He completely shuns Munich. He commands private opera performances at the court theater where the doors are locked, and he sits in the royal box in total darkness as the absolute sole audience member. He actually said, "I want to look myself, not be a spectacle for the masses."
He was systematically withdrawing from the 19th century. He was constructing an alternative reality. But here is the fatal flaw in his plan. Building fantasy worlds with real-world materials costs real-world money.
It always comes back to the budget.
You can ignore the parliament, you can ignore Bismarck, but you cannot ignore compound interest. Eventually, the bill comes due.
By 1885, Ludwig had completely exhausted his private royal revenues. Now, it should be noted, to be fair to him, he was largely spending his earned dynastic funds and his state-allotted royal allowance, not directly stealing from the public state treasury.
That's an important distinction.
However, the sheer scale of the debt became a state crisis because of who he owed.
Exactly. By early 1886, he is 14 million marks in debt. That is a staggering economy destabilizing sum. And he isn't just borrowing from local banks anymore. Foreign banks and royal families are holding his debt.
And they want their money.
Creditors are threatening to literally send bailiffs to Neuschwanstein and seize royal property, including the castles, to recoup their losses. This would be a massive, unprecedented international humiliation for the Bavarian state. The monarchy would become a laughingstock.
So Ludwig, completely detached from financial reality, sends orders to his cabinet ministers demanding a new 6 million mark credit line. He wants them to borrow money from the Rothschilds, from anyone.
And what do the ministers say?
The ministers, horrified, refuse. They tell him the state cannot guarantee his private debts. And Ludwig's response, he threatens to simply fire his entire cabinet and replace them with people who will find him the money.
And that threat is the catalyst for his downfall. The government ministers realize they are entirely out of options. They cannot control his spending. He will bankrupt the royal house and embarrass the state.
But they can't just fire a king.
All right, the Bavarian Constitution did not have a simple legal mechanism for a cabinet to depose a monarch just because they disagreed with his financial irresponsibility. To legally remove Ludwig from power and install his uncle, Prince Leopold, as regent, they needed to prove the king was medically fundamentally unfit to rule.
They needed to prove he was insane.
Yes, and this leads to what can only be described as a psychiatric coup d'etat. The government ministers conspired to build a medical case against him. They hire a panel of 4 psychiatrists, led by the director of the Munich asylum, Dr. Bernhard von Gudden.
We have to look at the methodology of this medical report because it is deeply controversial. Dr. von Gudden was a highly respected pioneer in neuroanatomy and psychiatry at the time.
He was a serious professional.
He authors a lengthy, damning report declaring King Ludwig suffers from paranoia, is incurable, and is entirely unfit to rule. But what is the foundational flaw in this diagnosis?
Oh, it's unbelievable. Dr. von Gudden never actually examines the king.
Not once.
Not once during this crisis. He hadn't spoken to Ludwig in over a decade.
It's insane. The entire diagnosis is based on hearsay. The ministers sent agents to bribe, interrogate, and squeeze the castle servants to compile a massive list of eccentricities.
And let's look at what constituted proof of his insanity in this report.
It's mostly just weird quirks, right?
Exactly. It was his pathological shyness. The fact that he violently avoided state business, dining outdoors in the freezing cold, wearing heavy winter coats in the summer heat, demanding his hair be curled every single day.
My favorite is the dinner party one.
The fact that he had imaginary out-loud conversations with the spirits of Louis XIV and Marie Antoinette at his dinner table.
Now, to be clear, these behaviors certainly paint a picture of an eccentric, deeply troubled, intensely anxious individual, but they hardly meet the rigorous medical standards for legal, total incapacitation.
Even in the 19th century, other politicians saw right through it. Otto von Bismarck himself read the psychiatric report and scoffed at it.
Really? What did Bismarck say?
Bismarck called the evidence rakings from the king's wastepaper basket and cupboards. Bismarck accurately assessed that the Bavarian ministers were simply sacrificing the king to save their own political careers and balance the books.
So what does this all mean for us today looking back? Was he actually clinically insane or just a deeply depressed, highly eccentric billionaire who despised his job and the politicians around him? Like, if we evaluate him with modern psychology, what is the verdict?
Modern psychiatric analysis of the historical record leans heavily away from the madness or paranoia diagnosis used to depose him. Today, experts suggest Ludwig likely exhibited a schizotypal personality disorder or suffered from severe, crippling depression and social anxiety.
Which makes sense given his childhood.
Totally. He was undoubtedly dealing with the profound trauma of his lost sovereignty, his repressed sexuality, and his chronic self-imposed isolation. He engaged in massive maladaptive daydreaming.
But he wasn't disconnected from reality completely.
Exactly, and this is key. He remained coherent. He could conduct complex business when he chose to. He oversaw the incredibly detailed architectural plans of his castles. He understood the nature of his debts. He was not legally insane in a way that justified a deposition without a single personal examination.
But the government doesn't care about the nuance. They have their piece of paper with the doctor's signature and they push forward. On the night of June 9th, a state commission arrives at Neuschwanstein to arrest him.
And it doesn't go smoothly at first.
No, it's a disaster at first. The local police and the castle guards actually protect the king, and local peasants gather with pitchforks to defend their fairy tale king. But eventually, the reality of the situation sets in.
The state power wins out.
On June 12th, the commission gains entry. Ludwig is completely blindsided. He famously confronts Dr. von Gudden in the hallway and asks the most logical, damning question possible. How can you declare me insane? After all, you have never seen or examined me before.
Gudden's reply was chillingly bureaucratic, a true testament to institutional arrogance. He told the king, "Your Majesty, it is unnecessary. We have at our disposal enough information which gives us the necessary evidence."
So cold.
The king, resigned to his fate, is taken from his beloved, unfinished fairy tale castle. He is transported in a carriage to Berg Castle on the shores of Lake Starnberg, just south of Munich. Berg had been quickly retrofitted with bars on the windows and peepholes in the doors to serve as his luxurious high-security prison.
Locked in a retrofitted castle with the very doctor who signed his political death warrant, it is incredibly grim. He has lost everything. And this brings us to the final, most mysterious and heavily debated act of Ludwig's life. June 13, 1886, the day after he arrives at Berg as a prisoner.
The timeline of this day is critical. It is a rainy, dreary Sunday. Throughout the day, Ludwig appears remarkably calm, composed, and cooperative. He has lunch, he converses with the doctors. He doesn't seem manic or violent.
He's playing along.
In the early evening, he asks Dr. von Gudden to accompany him on a walk through the parkland along the shore of the lake.
Around 6:45 p.m., they head out. It's raining lightly. And Gudden, feeling incredibly optimistic about the king's compliant mood, makes a fatal error in judgment.
A massive mistake.
He turns to the psychiatric orderlies who are assigned to guard the king, and he explicitly dismisses them. "No attendant may walk with us," he says. The two men, the deposed king and the doctor who ruined him, vanish into the rainy, darkening park alone. They are never seen alive again.
When they do not return by 8:00 p.m., a massive panic ensues. A search party is organized with lanterns and torches. Hours pass in the storm as they scour the park. Finally, around 11:30 p.m., a searcher on a rowboat spots something in the shallows near the shore. The bodies of King Ludwig and Dr. von Gudden are discovered floating head and shoulders above the water. The water there is incredibly shallow, barely waist deep. Ludwig's pocket watch had stopped at exactly 6:54 p.m.
Just 9 minutes into the walk, 9 minutes from leaving the castle to entering the water. The immediate official government ruling issued to the press was suicide by drowning. The narrative was that the Mad King threw himself into the lake in a fit of despair, and the heroic doctor drowned trying to save him.
But the forensic and historical details absolutely do not add up.
Not at all. If we break down the theories, the suicide theory has massive glaring flaws. Let's look at the forensics.
First, Ludwig was an incredibly strong, capable swimmer in his youth. Second, as we mentioned, the water where they were found was only waist deep. It is very difficult for a strong man to drown himself in waist-deep water.
And the autopsy, right?
Most damning of all, the official autopsy conducted shortly after found absolutely no water in Ludwig's lungs. You cannot drown in the traditional sense without inhaling water.
Plus his religion.
Psychologically, Ludwig was a devout traditional Catholic. Suicide was considered a mortal sin, an act that would sever him from God forever. He had previously expressed deep theological aversion to the idea.
Okay, so if not suicide, then what? Theory 2 is the political assassination theory. This one is dark and has fueled Bavarian conspiracy theories for over a century.
The murder plot.
The theory is that government agents, terrified that the highly popular Ludwig might escape, regain power, and exact revenge on the cabinet, simply murdered him. There were rumors that his cousin, Empress Elizabeth of Austria, the famous Sisi, was waiting nearby across the lake with a getaway carriage.
The evidence for the assassination theory relies heavily on oral traditions, suppressed testimonies, and posthumous notes. For example, Ludwig's personal fisherman, a man named Jacob Little, supposedly left a sealed note to be opened after his death.
What did the note say?
The note allegedly claimed that Little was waiting in the reeds with a boat to row the king to safety, and he saw the king shot in the back from the bank as he stepped into the water. There were also persistent legendary rumors of a gray coat belonging to the king that had 2 bullet holes in the back, which was supposedly smuggled out of the country.
But the fatal flaw with the assassination theory is, again, the official autopsy. The medical examination, witnessed by several doctors, showed absolutely no bullet wounds, stabs, or scars on the king's body.
It's hard to hide a bullet hole from multiple doctors.
And practically speaking, a conspiracy to shoot a monarch, cover up the entry wounds, stage a drowning, and successfully silence all the guards, doctors, and search party members forever would be nearly impossible to maintain perfectly. Which leads us to the third and, frankly, most scientifically and historically plausible theory.
Misadventure, struggle, and a failed escape.
If we synthesize all the forensic evidence, the geography, and the psychology of the moment, this is the most likely scenario.
Ludwig almost certainly planned to escape. He knew the shoreline of Lake Starnberg intimately. He likely made a sudden break for the water, intending to wade out and swim to a waiting loyalist boat or simply cross the shallows to freedom.
And Gudden tries to stop him.
Gudden, realizing his high-profile patient was fleeing, chased after him into the water and attempted to physically restrain him.
And remember the physical disparity here. Ludwig was a massive guy. He was 6'4", and at this point in his life, he had gained significant weight. He had a 120-centimeter girth.
And Gudden was a 62-year-old academic.
A violent physical struggle ensues in the 12-degree-Celsius water.
And the autopsy of Dr. von Gudden supports this entirely. Gudden's body showed clear signs of a brutal, violent struggle. He had blows to the head and face, deep scratch marks on his neck, and evidence of strangulation.
Ludwig was fighting for his life.
Ludwig, in a panic for his freedom, likely fought Gudden off, perhaps drowning him or strangling him into unconsciousness. But the extreme exertion of the fight, combined with the immense psychological stress of the arrest and the sudden, shocking impact of the freezing alpine water, triggered a fatal physiological reaction in the king.
The lack of water in Ludwig's lungs points exactly to what modern doctors call a severe laryngospasm, or dry drowning. The vocal cords violently spasm and seal the airway shut due to the shock of the cold water, asphyxiating the victim without water ever reaching the lungs.
Or, given his size and stress, he simply suffered a massive, sudden cardiovascular collapse. A heart attack.
He fought for his freedom. He won the physical battle against his captor in the water, but his overstressed heart finally gave out in the freezing shallows of Lake Starnberg.
It is a devastatingly tragic, almost operatic end. The monarch who lived his entire life in his imagination, who tried to build a shield of myth and stone against the modern world, was ultimately struck down by the brutal, inescapable physical reality of cold water and a failing heart.
Ludwig's life ends in tragedy on that Sunday evening. But the story of the fairy tale king and his impact on the world is far from over. Because the ultimate, almost unbelievable irony of this entire saga happens almost immediately after his death.
7 weeks. That is all it took.
Just 7 weeks.
Just 7 weeks after Ludwig died, the Bavarian government, desperate to recoup the massive 14 million mark debt that had caused his political downfall, does the unthinkable. They open his beloved, intensely private, unfinished castles to the paying public.
It is the ultimate introvert's nightmare. He built Neuschwanstein, Linderhof, and Herrenchiemsee specifically to hide from the public. He commanded private operas so he wouldn't have to look at other people. He literally said he wanted his castles destroyed after his death so the profane eyes of the public could never see them.
And immediately, the government turns his sacred sanctuaries into tourist attractions, charging an entrance fee.
But here's the massive financial vindication. Today, Neuschwanstein Castle alone has welcomed over 60 million visitors.
60 million.
It is the global, undisputed icon of the fairy tale aesthetic. Walt Disney visited it and used it as the direct inspiration for Sleeping Beauty Castle at Disneyland, cementing its silhouette into the global consciousness. The revenue generated by tourism to Ludwig's 3 palaces has brought billions with a B into the Bavarian economy.
It far, far exceeds the relatively paltry 14 million marks of debt that caused his deposition. His so-called madness turned out to be the greatest economic investment the Bavarian state ever accidentally made.
It's wild to think about.
And if we connect this to the broader picture of German history and culture, the impact is profound. In the 19th century, Bismarck's Prussian model was dominating Germany. It was an era defined by militarism, rapid industrialization, smoke, steel, and what Bismarck proudly called blood and iron.
Very grim stuff.
Ludwig represented a desperate, romantic, almost doomed resistance to that exact modernity. He preserved the regional myth, the emotional depth, and the artistic beauty of Germany.
And we cannot forget the music. Without Ludwig's obsessive, financially ruinous patronage, Richard Wagner's career was over. Without Ludwig paying off his debts, building him a theater, and funding the Bayreuth Festival, Wagner almost certainly never finishes the Ring cycle.
He never writes Parsifal.
Exactly. Ludwig's patronage literally ensured the creation and survival of some of the most influential boundary-pushing music in Western history. The soundtracks to our modern epic movies exist largely because Ludwig bailed out a fugitive composer.
Exactly. History, written by the political victors, often writes off Ludwig merely as a mentally unstable eccentric who abandoned his duties. But his enduring legacy suggests he was actually a deeply committed, uncompromising cultural visionary.
He just fought a completely different kind of war.
He fought a war for the aesthetic and spiritual soul of his culture.
Which brings us right back to you listening to this deep dive right now. We all have our personal ways of retreating from a world that demands too much of us, a world that feels too harsh, too loud, or too intensely focused on the practical and the profitable. Whether it's binge-watching a sprawling fantasy show for an entire weekend, pouring hundreds of hours into building a perfect impregnable base in a video game, or carefully curating a beautiful aesthetic on your phone to block out the stress of your commute. We all understand that impulse.
We all want a Neuschwanstein of our own.
Ludwig just happened to be the one guy who had the royal treasury and the absolute political authority to actually build his escape out of white limestone on an alpine cliff.
And that leaves us with a lingering, provocative question to explore on your own long after this is over. The history books will always tell us that Otto von Bismarck unequivocally won the 19th century.
Because he forged an empire.
Right. He won it with shrewd politics, iron, treaties, and war. And they tell us that the mad king of Bavaria lost his century to fantasy, opera, and crippling debt. But look at the world today. Millions of people travel to Germany every single year from every corner of the globe. They don't travel there to look at Bismarck's parliament buildings. They don't buy postcards of Prussian treaties. They travel, wait in line, and spend their money to stand in absolute silent awe of Ludwig's dreams. So when we measure the true longevity of a legacy, who actually won?
Wow.
Did the fairy tale king, in the end, win the war for Germany's soul?
That is a phenomenal thought to leave on. Thank you so much for taking this deep dive with us. We'll catch you on the next one.